Think you know the Tudors? You know the kings and queens, the grand battles, the famous romances. But what if I told you the real power players weren't always wearing crowns? Welcome to my channel Words of Time, and in this video dives deep into the forgotten figures, the shadowy manipulators, and the unsung heroes who truly pulled the strings and shaped one of history's most iconic eras. Many people imagine Tudor England as a time when the monarch's word was absolute, when the will of the king or queen alone shaped every political, social, and cultural turn of the kingdom. The image of Henry VIII tearing England from Rome with a single decree, or Elizabeth I commanding loyalty through sheer force of personality, is deeply fixed in popular memory. This idea, though compelling, hides a more complex truth. Power in Tudor England did not rest entirely with the crown. It existed in networks, shifting alliances, and behind-the-scenes influences that often held as much sway as royal command. The Tudors ruled, but they never ruled alone. Their reigns were woven together with the actions, ambitions, and manipulations of people whose names did not always appear in chronicles or ballads. These were advisors, courtiers, clergy, spies, financiers, and even family members, moving in the shadows of the throne, shaping history in quiet but decisive ways. To understand Tudor England fully, one must look beyond the glittering crown and the iconic portraits of monarchs dressed in velvet and pearls. The machinery of rule was intricate. The monarchy was the visible face of power, but its strength came from its ability to negotiate, persuade, and sometimes deceive. No Tudor sovereign could act in isolation. Every royal decision was the outcome of countless influences. Behind every proclamation or marriage alliance, there were arguments in council chambers, whispered warnings from servants, and secret letters passed between rivals. The story of Tudor England is not just about kings and queens. It is about the people who stood just outside the light, pulling the levers of influence while appearing loyal, obedient, or invisible. One of the most revealing examples of this hidden power lies in the early reign of Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. After defeating Richard III at Bosworth, Henry established a fragile claim to the throne. His right to rule was not secure by blood alone. He married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, but his reign depended on careful political management. Henry understood that survival required more than royal lineage. He built an administration that relied on capable servants, lawyers, and financial officers who could strengthen his authority without drawing too much attention to themselves. Men such as Reginald Bray and Edmund Dudley helped Henry consolidate wealth and control through taxation and financial surveillance. They were not royal by birth, but their influence on policy was immense. They operated in a gray zone between loyalty and ambition, ensuring the crown's stability while enriching themselves. Henry's power depended as much on their calculations as on his own determination. When his son Henry VIII ascended the throne, he inherited not only a kingdom, but also a system of governance that relied on skilled and often ruthless advisors. The young Henry began as an idealistic monarch, eager for glory in war and romance. Yet even in his early years, the real work of government rested on others. Thomas Wolsey, the son of a butcher from Ipswich, rose from humble origins to become the most powerful man in England after the king himself. Wolsey managed diplomacy, finance, and church affairs with extraordinary control. For a decade, his authority overshadowed that of nobles born to privilege. He used his intelligence and charm to maintain favor, but his success also revealed how fragile royal authority could be when entrusted to one man's ambition. When Wolsey failed to secure the papal annulment Henry needed to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his fall was swift and complete. Yet even his downfall demonstrates the hidden structure of Tudor power. While the king appeared to command, the course of the nation often turned on the success or failure of men like Wolsey, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. After Wolsey came another figure, whose influence continues to fascinate historians and readers alike, Thomas Cromwell. Unlike Wolsey, Cromwell had no clerical background and rose purely through political skill. He understood how to use parliament, legal reform, and propaganda to achieve the king's goals. The English Reformation, often remembered as Henry's personal rebellion against the papacy, was in large part Cromwell's creation. He organized the dissolution of monasteries, redirected church wealth to the crown, and transformed royal power into something both secular and absolute. Yet even Cromwell's success came at a price. His control over administrative detail and his ability to interpret the king's wishes made him indispensable, but also dangerous. Like Wolsey before him, Cromwell fell when he misjudged the king's mood. His execution revealed once again that those who served too well could become threats to the very monarch they supported. Still, his reforms endured, reshaping England's institutions for centuries. These examples reveal that the Tudor court was less a hierarchy than a constant negotiation of influence. Royal authority was always filtered through human relationships, favors, and betrayals. The monarch might set the tone, but the music was played by others. Courtiers such as the Seymours, the Howards, and the Dudleys learned how to manipulate access to the sovereign. They competed for proximity, because access meant influence. Every gesture at court carried meaning. A glance from the king, a seat at the council table, or a gift of land could elevate one man and destroy another. The court was a theater of power, where performance mattered as much as policy. The crown shone brightly, but the shadows around it were crowded. Power also flowed through women, though their contributions were often disguised by convention or dismissed by chroniclers. In an age that prized male leadership, women in the Tudor world used intelligence and subtlety to shape outcomes from within domestic and social boundaries. Catherine of Aragon, for instance, acted as regent while Henry fought in France, and even ordered the defense of the realm during the Battle of Flodden. Her leadership defied the notion of female passivity. And Boleyn, remembered largely for her tragic end, was in truth a political actor who understood the cultural and religious shifts of her time. Her support for reformist thinkers helped pave the way for the English Reformation. Her daughter, Elizabeth, inherited not only her mother's sharp mind, but also her understanding that appearances could conceal strategy. The Virgin Queen projected independence, yet she relied heavily on counselors such as William Cecil and Francis Walsingham to maintain control. Through their management of intelligence networks and propaganda, they kept her throne secure. Even within the royal household, servants, ladies-in-waiting, and messengers acted as intermediaries whose loyalty could alter the course of events. Religious figures, too, held immense unseen power. Before the break with Rome, the Church in England was a vast political machine that touched every level of society. Bishops sat in the king's council, monasteries controlled land and wealth, and the clergy influenced public opinion through the pulpit. After Henry severed ties with the papacy, religion became both a tool of governance and a battleground for conscience. The monarch might determine doctrine, but enforcement depended on local officials and preachers whose beliefs shaped how royal policy reached ordinary people. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, navigated these treacherous waters with quiet skill. His reforms under Henry and Edward transformed English worship, yet he also learned how vulnerable even high clerics could be to royal favor. When Mary Tudor restored Catholicism, Cranmer's influence vanished, and he met his death at the stake. His fate shows that the power of the Church, like that of the court, was always conditional and precarious. Economic and financial power formed another layer of hidden control. While kings and queens made grand gestures of policy, the financing of wars, palaces, and trade depended on the work of financiers and merchants. The growth of London as a commercial hub during the Tudor period brought new sources of wealth and new types of influence. Families such as the Greshams and the Fugers operated across borders, lending money to monarchs and shaping diplomatic choices. The crown often relied on loans to fund its ambitions, which gave these financiers quiet leverage. A monarch might rule by divine right, but debts had earthly consequences. The redistribution of monastic lands after the dissolution also created a new class of wealthy landowners whose interests could not be ignored. Their support was essential for maintaining order and collecting taxes. Thus, while the monarch appeared supreme, the economic base of power rested on the cooperation of individuals who held no titles but commanded resources. The Tudor state also relied on a network of informants and spies whose work rarely appeared in official records. Intelligence gathering was crucial in a period marked by rebellion, religious division, and foreign threat. Under Elizabeth, Francis Walsingham built an elaborate system of espionage that uncovered plots and intercepted correspondence. His agents operated across Europe, infiltrating Catholic networks and preventing assassinations. Walsingham's influence extended beyond intelligence. He shaped foreign policy by controlling what the Queen and her council knew. His success depended on secrecy, and his power lay in his ability to make others act on information he selectively revealed. Through him, one sees how control of knowledge became a new form of authority in the Tudor world. Even outside the elite, influence could rise from unexpected quarters. Servants, scribes, and secretaries, though low in rank, sometimes held the key to royal decisions simply because they controlled access or information. The transmission of a letter or the timing of a message could alter alliances. In a world where communication was slow and personal, trust mattered more than hierarchy. Many of these figures remain nameless in the records, yet they formed the connective tissue of Tudor administration. Without their discretion and diligence, the machinery of government would have faltered. To speak of hidden power in Tudor England is also to recognize how cultural forces shaped authority. Plays, pamphlets, and art carried political meaning. The Tudor court understood the value of image. Portraits by Holbein and others were not mere decoration, but instruments of propaganda, projecting stability and magnificence. Writers such as Thomas More and later Edmund Spenser reflected and influenced political ideals. The control of printed material became a means of maintaining order. Censorship, licensing, and patronage determined which voices could be heard. The people who managed these systems, printers, censors, and advisors, exercised quiet influence over the national imagination. They helped define what loyalty and rebellion meant in an age of transformation. The persistence of these shadowy influences raises an important question for our own time. Why revisit these hidden histories now? The answer lies in the growing awareness that power is rarely what it seems. Modern society, like Tudor England, often celebrates visible leaders while overlooking the networks that enable them. The study of history has shifted from heroic narratives to more nuanced understandings of how authority functions. By examining who truly held power in the past, we gain insight into how influence operates today. The Tudor period offers a vivid example of how personal ambition, strategic loyalty, and hidden negotiation shape political realities. It reminds us that behind every public decision lies a web of unseen forces. Contemporary interest in power dynamics, whether in politics, corporations, or social movements, mirrors the questions that can be asked of the Tudor world. Who makes the choices that define a nation's direction? How does information become power? What happens when those behind the throne, or behind the scenes, miscalculate their reach? The downfall of figures like Wolsey or Cromwell echoes the modern reality that proximity to power brings both opportunity and danger. Their stories illustrate that influence without visibility is both potent and precarious. They also reveal the moral complexity of serving authority. Loyalty can demand compromise, and ambition can disguise itself as duty. Looking beyond the crown does not diminish the achievements of the Tudor monarchs. It enriches them. It allows us to see Henry VIII not just as a tyrant or visionary, but as a ruler navigating a maze of competing interests. It shows Elizabeth I not only as a symbol of national glory, but as a strategist who mastered the art of delegation and image. It also recovers the countless individuals whose contributions have long been overlooked. Clerks who drafted laws, scholars who advised reform, women who mediated disputes, and merchants who financed exploration. These people shaped England's path as surely as those who wore the crown. The story of Tudor power is one of constant adaptation. The monarchy survived because it could absorb and redirect the ambitions of others. Every generation of Tudors learned to manage the tension between visibility and influence. Henry VII built systems of control. Henry VIII used charisma and fear. Edward's regents governed through committees. Mary relied on faith and alliance. Elizabeth turned politics into performance. In each case, success depended on those willing to serve, advise, and sometimes deceive. The monarchy was never a single voice, but a chorus of competing tones, harmonized or discordant depending on circumstance. The fascination with these hidden actors endures because they expose the human side of power. They remind us that history is not shaped by destiny, but by decision. The shadowy figures of Tudor England were flawed, ambitious, loyal, and treacherous by turns. Their actions reveal how influence operates not only through command, but through persuasion, access, and control of knowledge. Their legacy invites reflection on how much of leadership, in any age, depends on those who stand just outside the spotlight. Reconsidering Tudor power through this lens brings the past into dialogue with the present. In an era that values transparency, yet still wrestles with hidden influence, the Tudor experience feels strikingly familiar. The structures may have changed, but the patterns remain. Advisors still shape policy, networks still determine opportunity, and perception still molds reality. By tracing these continuities, we can better understand how societies distribute power, justify authority, and remember their leaders. The Tudors, often portrayed as autocrats, were in truth participants in a complex dance of control and dependence. Their reigns teach that even absolute power needs intermediaries, and that history's most enduring decisions often emerge from unseen hands. To look beyond the crown is to see Tudor England as a living organism rather than a rigid hierarchy. It was a realm where influence shifted with circumstance, where ideas moved faster than decrees, and where the appearance of control masked constant negotiation. The monarch was the symbol, but the substance lay in the relationships that surrounded the throne. Recognizing this complexity does more than correct a misconception. It changes how we read the past and how we think about the present. It reminds us that power, in any form, is never solitary. It is shared, contested, and redefined with every act of persuasion and resistance. The Tudors ruled in name, but the true architects of their age were those who knew how to wield influence without wearing a crown. When examining the nature of Tudor power, it is impossible to ignore those who worked quietly yet effectively beneath the surface of royal authority. These figures, the master manipulators of their age, shaped policy and defined the direction of England while rarely holding the throne themselves. They built networks of loyalty, managed secrets, and turned influence into action. Their stories show how the Tudor monarchy, though presented as absolute, depended on complex webs of trust and manipulation. The most striking examples of this hidden governance can be seen in the careers of Cardinal Wolsey, Thomas Cromwell, and the confidants of Queen Mary. Each in their own way reshaped England, proving that true power often lay in the minds and hands of those who stood beside, rather than upon, the throne. Cardinal Wolsey's career remains one of the most fascinating demonstrations of ambition and administrative skill in English history. Born to a modest family in Ipswich, Wolsey was far from the traditional path of nobility or royal privilege. His education at Oxford gave him not only learning, but an understanding of how intellect could serve as a ladder to power. As he entered royal service under Henry VII and later under Henry VIII, Wolsey demonstrated a rare ability to anticipate royal needs and solve problems before they escalated. His rise was meteoric. Within a few years, he had become the king's most trusted servant, holding multiple positions that granted him control over church affairs, diplomacy, and finance. His dual role as a churchman and statesman allowed him to move freely between religious and political worlds, blurring the lines between the two and placing himself at the center of almost every major decision. Wolsey's power extended beyond official appointments. He understood that authority required more than titles. It required networks. He built a system of loyalty that stretched across England, placing men he trusted in positions where they could report to him, influence local affairs, and protect his interests. His wealth and influence made him second only to the king, and for many years, some even viewed him as the true ruler of England. Ambassadors and nobles alike approached him rather than the king when seeking favor. He managed foreign alliances, arranged treaties, and mediated conflicts between nobles. His residence at Hampton Court, later taken over by Henry himself, symbolized his reach and sophistication. It was not only a home, but also a political headquarters from which Wolsey managed the machinery of state. Yet, Wolsey's success also exposed the delicate balance of power at the Tudor court. His control depended on his ability to satisfy the king's desires while maintaining his own influence. Henry's ambitions were grand and shifting, seeking both glory abroad and personal satisfaction at home. When the question of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon began to dominate his reign, Wolsey faced an impossible task. The king demanded an annulment that would free him to marry in Bullen, but Wolsey's negotiations with the papacy faltered. Rome, constrained by international politics and the influence of Catherine's nephew, the Emperor Charles, refused to act swiftly. The delay angered Henry, and Wolsey's once secure position began to crumble. His enemies at court, long resentful of his dominance, seized the moment to undermine him. They whispered that he had served himself before his sovereign, that his loyalty to the church outweighed his loyalty to England. Wolsey's fall was as dramatic as his rise. Stripped of office and wealth, he retreated from court life and faced charges of treason. He died before trial, spared the humiliation of public execution. Yet his influence endured. The administrative systems he created, the royal council, the expansion of bureaucratic efficiency, the diplomatic strategies, remained part of England's political fabric. He had demonstrated how a single individual, through skill and organization, could command the machinery of state even without royal blood. His life revealed the opportunities and dangers of proximity to power, showing that the crown's authority was often sustained by the invisible strength of those who served it. If Wolsey represented the height of religious power under a Tudor monarch, Thomas Cromwell embodied the rise of secular administration. Cromwell's path to influence was even more unlikely. Born into a modest family, with a father known more for business disputes than political ambition, Cromwell spent his early years abroad as a soldier, merchant, and legal advisor. These experiences shaped his pragmatic worldview and gave him a deep understanding of commerce and law. When he entered the service of Cardinal Wolsey, Cromwell quickly distinguished himself as an able administrator and problem solver. After Wolsey's downfall, he might have shared his master's fate, but instead he adapted. By aligning himself directly with Henry VIII, he rose from the shadow of one fallen statesman to become the architect of a new political. Cromwell's genius lay in his grasp of how institutions could serve as instruments of control. He recognized that the old medieval structures of power, noble privilege, church authority, and feudal obligation, were weakening. In their place, he saw the potential for a centralized state governed by law and loyal servants rather than hereditary entitlement. His role in the English Reformation was not only to satisfy the king's personal wish to annul his marriage, but to use that moment to redefine the relationship between crown and church. Through carefully crafted legislation, Cromwell helped Henry claim supremacy over the English church, cutting ties with Rome and transferring religious authority to the monarchy. The dissolution of the monasteries was his most transformative project. Officially justified as a reform of corruption, it was in truth a calculated redistribution of wealth and power. By seizing monastic lands and revenues, Cromwell enriched the crown and secured the loyalty of those who benefited from the new order. The religious shift was also a political revolution. The church, once a semi-independent force with its own courts and estates, became an arm of the state. Cromwell's reforms expanded bureaucracy, standardized record-keeping, and established new levels of accountability in governance. Yet, like Wolsey, Cromwell's success bred resentment. Nobles viewed him as an upstart who wielded too much influence. His enemies accused him of heresy, greed, and manipulation. His reforming zeal, which at times seemed to outpace the king's comfort, made him vulnerable. The marriage he arranged between Henry and Anne of Cleves was meant to secure an alliance, but when the union displeased the king, Cromwell's enemies struck. Within months, he was arrested, accused of treason, and executed. The same administrative precision that had built his power was turned against him in the machinery of accusation. Cromwell's fall did not erase his achievements. He had laid the groundwork for a modern English state, one governed through offices, statutes, and documentation rather than purely through personal favor. His vision of authority as something systematized rather than inherited reshaped English governance permanently. Even his opponents came to rely on the institutions he created. Cromwell's legacy illustrates how mastery of process can rival the charisma of monarchy, and how reform, though driven by necessity, can outlive its architect. The pattern of hidden influence continued into the reign of Queen Mary, but it took a different form. Unlike her father, who relied heavily on male advisors, Mary's court was marked by the presence of women whose counsel shaped her policies in ways historians have only recently begun to explore. As England's first ruling queen, Mary faced unique challenges. Her legitimacy was questioned by some, her faith was divisive, and her marriage to Philip of Spain stirred fears of foreign domination. To navigate these tensions, she relied on a circle of confidants who combined personal loyalty with political skill. These women operated within the boundaries of court etiquette, yet managed to influence the Queen's most private and public decisions. One of the most significant figures in Mary's inner circle was Susan Clarenceux, her long-serving lady-in-waiting. Though rarely mentioned in official records, Susan played a key role in managing the Queen's household and served as an intermediary between Mary and her council. Her discretion and devotion allowed her to act as both companion and advisor. Through her, messages were conveyed and disputes softened. In a court defined by suspicion and faction, such intermediaries were essential. Another influential woman was Jane Dormer, later Duchess of Feria, who combined youthful charm with political insight. She became one of Mary's most trusted attendants, privy to her thoughts and concerns. Dormer's later writings offer rare glimpses into the Queen's state of mind and the pressures she faced. Her ability to communicate Mary's intentions to foreign allies, especially to the Spanish court, made her an informal diplomat. The trust between queen and attendant allowed private feelings to shape public policy. Mary's half-sister Elizabeth, though technically her rival, also moved through the same circles of female influence. The tension between them was not only political but also personal, shaped by shared experience and differing visions of faith and rule. Mary's reliance on women reflected not weakness but adaptation. In a court where male advisors often served conflicting interests, she found stability in female companionship and loyalty. These relationships reveal how gendered expectations could be reinterpreted as instruments of authority. The domestic sphere, often dismissed as private, became a channel through which significant decisions were made. Mary's marriage negotiations and her religious restoration both bore the imprint of these unseen hands. Her confidants helped shape her image as a pious yet firm ruler, counseling her on matters of conscience and strategy. They managed her correspondence, interpreted her moods to ambassadors, and at times softened her resolve when political realities demanded compromise. Even her decision to pursue reconciliation with Rome, often portrayed as purely doctrinal, was influenced by personal advice and the moral support of those closest to her. The Queen's household became a space where emotional and political life blended, where private counsel could steer the course of national policy. The pattern that connects Wolsey, Cromwell, and Mary's confidants is not one of identical roles, but of shared methods. Each understood that the real work of governance often happens outside formal structures. Wolsey built his power through networks of patronage, Cromwell through systems of administration, Mary's attendants through the intimacy of trust. Together, they demonstrate that policy is never shaped by decree alone. It evolves through conversation, persuasion, and manipulation, acts that require emotional intelligence as much as ambition. These master manipulators remind us that Tudor England was a living organism of competing influences. The monarch, though central, was only one part of the system. Every decision, from the creation of new laws to the signing of treaties, was filtered through personalities and relationships. The visible drama of court life, banquets, ceremonies, proclamations, masked a deeper process of negotiation and control. To understand the Tudors is to understand that the crown was both a symbol and a stage, where countless unseen actors played their parts. What makes their stories enduring is the way they reveal the paradox of power. It must appear absolute while remaining dependent. Wolsey's brilliance could not save him when royal favor shifted. Cromwell's administrative mastery could not shield him from envy. Mary's reliance on her confidants strengthened her resolve, but also made her vulnerable to gossip and suspicion. Their influence, though immense, was always conditional, tied to the emotions and needs of those they served. Yet their legacies persisted because the systems they built, of loyalty, bureaucracy, and counsel, outlasted them. In perusing these figures today, we see reflections of modern politics and leadership. The strategies of influence, the balance between visibility and discretion, and the manipulation of information remain central to power in every age. The lessons of Wolsey, Cromwell, and Mary's inner circle remind us that authority depends as much on perception as on law, as much on persuasion as on command. Their work behind the throne shaped not only the policies of their time, but the very structure of how power is exercised. The story that began with the illusion of royal absolutism thus ends with a more nuanced understanding. Tudor England was not a stage dominated by monarchs alone, but a complex network where intellect, loyalty, and strategy determined fate. The crown may have gleamed in public, but its true brilliance came from those who polished it in private, the unseen hands that built, managed, and sometimes destroyed the machinery of rule. The Tudor world, for all its pageantry, was ultimately sustained by these master manipulators, whose quiet power continues to echo through history, reminding us that leadership is rarely a solitary art. Their influence, though often hidden, was the pulse that kept the Tudor state alive. Through them, we see that the history of England's most famous dynasty is not merely a chronicle of kings and queens, but a study of human ambition, skill, and the eternal dance between authority and those who shape it from the shadows. In the ongoing story of Tudor power, where official authority often masked deeper layers of influence, the court remained a living organism of whispers, alliances, and subtle manipulations. The royal household was not merely a symbol of monarchy. It was the heart of a social ecosystem in which ambition, charm, intellect, and loyalty intertwined. Within this intricate network, individuals who seemed peripheral could wield extraordinary influence. The court was not governed solely by decrees or military strength, but by relationships, perception, and persuasion. Those who mastered these arts, whether through family ties, intellect, or intimacy, became the architects of royal policy and culture. In this world, and Bullen's network of kin and supporters, the physicians and astrologers who guided decisions through counsel wrapped in superstition, and the royal mistresses who used proximity as their instrument of power reveal the many ways in which Tudor England was shaped not only by rulers, but by those who surrounded them. And Bullen's story is often told as one of passion and tragedy, the tale of a woman whose ambition led her to the throne and then to the scaffold. Yet to understand her place in the court's web of influence, one must look beyond the drama of her marriage and downfall, and did not emerge in isolation. She was the product of a network, family connections, cultural influences, and political alliances that collectively redefined the boundaries of female power in Tudor England. Born into the Bullen family, whose rise mirrored the broader social mobility of the age, and inherited ambition and education in equal measure. Her father, Thomas Bullen, was a skilled diplomat who understood the importance of cultivating both foreign and domestic allies. Her time spent in the courts of the Netherlands and France exposed her to sophistication and manners that few English women could match. When she returned to England, she brought with her not only refinement, but a new understanding of how presence, language, and wit could become instruments of power. Anne's entry into Henry's life did not immediately signal political upheaval, but as her relationship with the king deepened, she became the center of a growing faction. This faction included her family, the ambitious Bullens and Howards, along with courtiers who saw in her rise a chance to improve their own fortunes. Her charm and intelligence made her more than a consort. She became a participant in matters of state, influencing appointments, religious discussions, and even foreign policy. The Bullen network thrived on access, using kinship to expand influence across court offices. Her brother George, her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, and others within their circle positioned themselves strategically. They became conduits for petitions, brokers of royal favor, and intermediaries between the king and those seeking advancement. Anne's influence was not limited to politics. She became a cultural force. Her support for scholars and reformist thinkers helped introduce new ideas into English religious life. The English Reformation, though often portrayed as Henry's act of defiance against the Pope, gained momentum through the intellectual networks she encouraged. Books translated from French and Latin, discussing the role of scripture and conscience, circulated among her supporters. Her patronage signaled a shift in the intellectual tone of the court. For the first time, a queen-in-waiting used her social position to shape not only fashion and etiquette, but belief itself. Her assertiveness, however, challenged the established gender norms of the Tudor world. The idea that a woman could engage the king as an equal, offering counsel rather than mere affection, unsettled many courtiers. Her refusal to be a silent companion and her insistence on being recognized as a partner in both conversation and ambition provoked resentment. When Henry's affection turned to obsession, the political implications were immense. The king's decision to pursue marriage to and required breaking with Rome, a move that transformed England forever. Yet behind that monumental act stood a web of relationships. Family members negotiating alliances, friends spreading rumors or defending reputations, and servants carrying messages that could mean life or death. The same network that lifted and eventually contributed to her fall. Rival factions, led by those loyal to Catherine of Aragon and traditional Catholic interests, worked to undermine her. The court's social structure, once her greatest weapon, turned into a trap of suspicion and betrayal. When Henry's favor wavered, her connections became liabilities. Her brother's closeness to her was twisted into scandal. Her allies abandoned her to preserve their own standing. In the end, her execution was not simply the end of a queen, but the collapse of a carefully constructed social architecture that had, for a time, rivaled the power of kings. Yet her influence endured in the religious and cultural transformations she helped set in motion, and in the example she left of how networks could rival crowns in shaping history. While Anne's rise and fall illustrate how personal relationships could shift national policy, another form of hidden influence operated through knowledge that straddled the line between science and superstition. The Tudor Age, a period of intellectual ferment and spiritual uncertainty, gave rise to figures who wielded power through their perceived command of health, fate, and the unseen. Physicians and astrologers, though often dismissed today as practitioners of primitive arts, occupied positions of extraordinary trust. Their clients were not peasants but monarchs, nobles, and statesmen. In an age when disease could fell a ruler without warning and celestial events were believed to foretell destiny, those who claimed to interpret the mysteries of the body and the heavens held a kind of authority that transcended politics. Royal physicians were more than medical attendants. They were confidants with access to the most private aspects of a ruler's life. Their diagnoses, prescriptions, and even their silences could influence decisions at the highest levels. A ruler's health was not merely a personal matter, it was a matter of national stability. When a monarch fell ill, questions of succession, policy, and security followed swiftly. Physicians who managed to restore health, or who appeared capable of doing so, were rewarded with gratitude and influence. They could advocate for certain courtiers, support petitions, or shape attitudes through subtle suggestion. Their intimacy with their patients made them conduits of both information and persuasion. Astrologers, though operating in a realm that blended observation with mysticism, played a similar role. The belief that the stars could reveal divine will or human destiny was not fringe, but mainstream in Tudor England. Monarchs and courtiers alike consulted astrologers before major decisions, marriages, wars, treaties, and even the founding of institutions. Their readings could delay a royal journey, hasten a diplomatic move, or justify a military campaign. Figures such as Dr. John Dee, who advised both Mary and Elizabeth, combined astronomical skill with a deep sense of mystical purpose. Dee's calculations were treated with the same seriousness as military reports, and his interpretations of omens and celestial alignments could frame the political atmosphere. The influence of physicians and astrologers extended beyond their official roles. They were part of the informal communication network of the court. Servants, secretaries, and family members often turned to them for guidance, creating a web of dependence that spread through every level of power. A well-timed prediction or the suggestion of divine favor could sway belief, reinforce legitimacy, or diffuse doubt. For example, a monarch's decision to proceed with a controversial policy might be strengthened by an astrologer's assurance of cosmic approval. In this sense, the language of health and fate became a political tool. These men of special knowledge also reflected the anxieties of their age. The Tudors lived in a time of change, religious, scientific, and emotional. Old certainties were crumbling, and the boundary between faith and reason was still forming. Physicians and astrologers offered comfort by giving order to uncertainty. They spoke a language of patterns and causes that promised understanding in a world that often seemed chaotic. For rulers who bore the weight of divine expectation, such counsel was irresistible. Their role as healers of both body and spirit made them indispensable, but it also made them dangerous. A wrong diagnosis, a failed prophecy, or a rumor of sorcery could end a career or worse. Yet their presence at the heart of power demonstrates how deeply belief shaped governance. The Tudor court was as much a theater of the mind as it was of politics, and those who claimed to interpret hidden truths found themselves essential actors. Alongside these intellectual counselors were figures whose influence came not from study or lineage, but from intimacy. The royal mistresses of Tudor England occupied a space both scandalous and strategic. Their relationships with monarchs were personal, yet the consequences of those relationships often rippled through the corridors of government. In an age when courtship and favor intertwined, a mistress could become the most powerful advocate or the most feared opponent. Access to the royal bedchamber meant access to the monarch's thoughts at their most unguarded. In that private world, policy could be discussed, promises made, and enemies destroyed. Henry VIII's early reign provides ample evidence of this dynamic. Before and Boleyn captured his attention, several women held his affection and, through it, a measure of influence. Bessie Blount, the mother of his acknowledged illegitimate son, enjoyed privileges and protection uncommon for her rank. Her brief prominence demonstrated how intimacy could translate into material advantage, not only for herself, but for her family. The recognition of her son strengthened her standing and offered her relatives opportunities at court. Mary Boleyn and sister also occupied this ambiguous position. Her relationship with Henry predated Anne's and created a bond that later served the Boleyn family's ambitions. Though she did not wield the intellectual authority her sister later achieved, her intimacy with the king helped prepare the ground for the family's ascent. Such connections were rarely permanent, but their effects lingered. The courtiers who attached themselves to a royal mistress could rise rapidly through her influence, obtaining lands, titles, or pensions. In a world where proximity equaled opportunity, the mistress was both gatekeeper and potential queenmaker. The influence of royal mistresses was not confined to men. They often became patrons of the arts, sponsors of religious houses, or mediators in disputes. Their favor could soften royal tempers or divert harsh judgments. Yet their power was inherently unstable, tied to emotion rather than law. When affection faded, protection vanished. The precariousness of their status did not diminish their significance, however. Their ability to humanize or manipulate the ruler made them indispensable elements of the court's social design. Even after the role of mistress became less prominent under later monarchs, the pattern of female influence through proximity persisted. Companions, attendants, and confidants continued to shape royal behavior. They managed correspondence, delivered petitions, and conveyed opinions at moments when official channels were blocked. Their words, spoken in private, often carried more weight than the declarations of council meetings. The intimacy of personal service provided a form of soft power that defined the Tudor court as much as its laws or armies. Taken together, these different spheres of influence, and Bullen's network of kin and allies, the physicians and astrologers of special knowledge, and the royal mistresses who commanded access, reveal how the Tudor court functioned as a living system of social architecture. Power did not flow in a single direction from the throne outward. It circulated, shifting through invisible channels created by loyalty, persuasion, and desire. Every decision, every alliance, every act of betrayal emerged from this constant movement of influence. The court's brilliance lay in its ability to turn human emotion into political currency. Ambition, love, fear, and curiosity were all harnessed to maintain the machinery of rule. A monarch could not govern by decree alone. The cooperation of courtiers, families, and advisors was essential. Those who understood this reality, those who could whisper in the right ear or present the right omen, became architects of power as surely as generals or statesmen. These social architects remind us that history is built as much by subtlety as by strength. The decisions that shaped Tudor England did not always come from council chambers or battlefields. They often began with a conversation in a garden, a letter passed in secrecy, a glance across a crowded hall. The court was a place of spectacle, but behind the spectacle lay strategy. Every smile concealed calculation. Every favor demanded return. In this sense, the Tudor world reflects a timeless truth. The foundations of power are social before they are political. As we follow the thread from the administrators like Wolsey and Cromwell to the companions and confidants who shaped emotion and perception, the pattern becomes clear. Authority in Tudor England was not imposed but negotiated, built through relationships that required constant tending. The crown depended on the cooperation of its architects, those who designed its image, managed its health, and sustained its illusion of control. And Bullen's network demonstrated how kinship and intellect could challenge tradition. The physicians and astrologers showed how belief and fear could guide policy. The royal mistresses revealed the enduring strength of intimacy as a form of leverage. Each of these layers contributed to the complexity of the Tudor state. Together, they show that power is rarely a single, visible force. It is a web of human interactions, fragile, adaptable, and deeply personal. The court's whispers were not idle talk. They were the engines of decision-making, the pulse of government, the breath of politics. The Tudor world, so often remembered for its kings and queens, was in truth sustained by these social architects, whose influence reached every corner of the realm. To look at Tudor England through their eyes is to see a nation alive with negotiation and ambition. Every favor granted, every prediction spoken, every affection indulged became part of the larger structure of rule. The monarch might wear the crown, but it was the architects behind the whispers who kept the kingdom standing. Their legacies remind us that history is shaped not only by those who command armies or draft laws, but by those who master the subtler art of connection. In the end, it was this art that defined Tudor power, an intricate, ever-shifting balance between the visible and the unseen, the crown and the whisper, the ruler and those who knew how to guide the ruler's heart. In the shifting and layered world of Tudor England, where ambition shaped policy and personal influence often outweighed written law, one final and decisive realm of power lay not in bloodlines or courtly intrigue but in money. Wealth was the quiet current that sustained royal authority and dictated England's position in the wider world. While courtiers whispered in royal chambers and queens influenced faith and diplomacy through persuasion, the financial minds and mercantile classes became the true architects of the kingdom's reach. The Tudor crown, though wrapped in divine imagery, was bound by debt, dependent on merchants, and influenced by the hands that controlled credit and trade. Behind every treaty, every voyage, and every war lay the work of economic thinkers, guild leaders, and adventurers who transformed England from a fragile medieval realm into an emerging commercial power. Figures like Sir Thomas Gresham, the London mercers, and the daring privateers who blurred the line between piracy and patriotism all shaped the material foundation of Tudor strength. Their influence was not born of titles or courtly lineage, but of calculation, commerce, and risk, the new language of power that would define the coming modern age. Sir Thomas Gresham embodied the intersection of finance, statecraft, and innovation that underpinned this transformation. Born into a merchant family, he understood the value of reputation, trust, and credit in a world where gold itself was often less decisive than confidence in its promise. Gresham's rise came through his deep understanding of international markets and his ability to maneuver within the uncertain world of royal finance. The Tudor crown, particularly under Henry and later Elizabeth, suffered from chronic fiscal instability. Wars against France and Scotland, the cost of maintaining the navy, and the luxurious demands of court life strained the treasury. The frequent debasement of coinage, a desperate effort to stretch royal resources by reducing the silver content of coins, caused inflation and distrust both at home and abroad. It was into this unstable environment that Gresham brought discipline and insight. Acting as the royal agent in Antwerp, then one of Europe's major financial centers, he managed loans, negotiated exchange rates, and stabilized England's credit. His understanding of how international confidence shaped interest rates allowed him to correct the crown's poor reputation among foreign lenders. He famously advised that to maintain the value of English currency and secure favorable loans, the crown must consistently pay its debts, however strained the treasury might be. This practical principle later came to be known as Gresham's Law, reflecting his grasp of economic behavior. That bad money drives out good, and that credibility in currency and trade was as valuable as any hoard of bullion. Gresham's influence extended beyond financial management. He recognized that economic strength required infrastructure. His founding of the Royal Exchange in London was not merely a civic project, it was a statement of national ambition. Modeled after the great bourses of Antwerp and Amsterdam, the exchange gave English merchants a formal meeting place for conducting business, negotiating credit, and consolidating influence. It turned London from a provincial trading city into a hub of international finance. Through his efforts, commerce became not only a private enterprise but a matter of national prestige. The exchange was, in its way, a palace of trade, where merchants, not monarchs, set the tone of England's future. Gresham's work also influenced foreign policy. His financial management allowed the crown to maintain naval defense and to negotiate from a position of relative strength with continental powers. In times of crisis, such as when Elizabeth faced threats from Spain and internal Catholic opposition, Gresham's ability to secure funds without crippling the economy provided the foundation for stability. He stood at the intersection of money and monarchy, demonstrating that in the modern state, wealth was not simply treasure but trust, and policy rested on credit as much as on command. The world that Gresham helped shape did not belong to him alone. Beneath and around him operated powerful guilds whose collective strength rivaled the authority of the crown itself. Among these, the London mercers held a unique position. The Mercers' Company, one of the oldest and wealthiest livery guilds, represented merchants dealing in fine textiles, luxury goods, and international trade. Over time, their role expanded far beyond commerce. They became financiers, landlords, and political players, shaping not only markets but laws. Their influence on trade regulation and royal finance reflected the growing power of organized capital in Tudor society. The mercers' authority came from their control of networks that extended across Europe. Their members traded in Antwerp, Venice, and the Levant, connecting England's markets with the wealth of the continent. Their success made them indispensable to the monarchy, which relied on loans from wealthy merchants to fund wars and projects. Unlike the landed nobility, whose wealth was tied to inheritance and agriculture, the mercers' fortunes moved with ships and exchange rates. They understood that profit required both risk and protection, and they offered both to the crown. In return for their support, they received privileges, monopolies, and exemptions that strengthened their dominance over trade. The Mercers were not only financiers but also political negotiators. Their collective influence in the City of London gave them a voice in national affairs. When the Crown sought loans, it often turned to the guilds as intermediaries, knowing that their members could mobilize capital quickly and discreetly. In effect, the guilds became unofficial bankers to the realm. Their control of credit gave them quiet leverage over royal decisions. A delay in payment or a refusal to extend a loan could pressure even a monarch. The relationship between crown and city was a delicate dance of dependence and negotiation. The guilds also shaped trade law and regulation. Through their lobbying and petitions, they influenced tariffs, import restrictions, and navigation policies. Their interests often aligned with the crown's desire for national self-sufficiency and expansion, but they also defended their own monopolies fiercely. The Mercers in particular sought to control access to foreign markets and to limit competition from smaller traders. This created tension between the old guild system and the emerging class of independent merchants who sought freedom from restrictive practices. The resulting debates over regulation, privilege, and open trade anticipated the struggles that would define later English economic policy. The Mercers' civic role extended into philanthropy and education, reflecting their understanding that influence could be preserved through cultural investment. They endowed schools, supported apprenticeships, and financed public works. Their wealth shaped the urban landscape of London, from churches to charitable foundations. Yet beneath their benevolence lay calculation. Each act of generosity reinforced their moral authority and justified their privileges. The Mercers' dominance was thus maintained not only through money but through reputation, the same principle that guided Gresham's philosophy of credit. While Gresham and the Mercers built systems of finance and commerce that strengthened England's foundations, another kind of economic power emerged on the open sea. The Tudor age was an era of exploration and aggression, where naval might and private enterprise intertwined. The expansion of England's reach across the oceans depended on men who operated at the margins of legality. Pirates, privateers, and adventurers whose loyalty to the crown was as flexible as their pursuit of profit. Among them, Francis Drake stands as the most famous, a symbol of how personal ambition could serve, challenge, and redefine royal power. Drake's career began not in royal service, but in the world of private maritime trade. He and his kinsmen from the Hawkins family were involved in the slave trade and in smuggling, activities that blurred the boundary between commerce and crime. Yet their ventures reflected the realities of Tudor economics. England lacked the vast imperial networks of Spain or Portugal, and its merchants sought entry into lucrative markets by any means. When the Spanish crown restricted trade with its colonies, English sailors responded with force. The sea became both battlefield and marketplace. Drake's voyages captured the spirit of this new age. His circumnavigation of the globe was not merely an act of exploration, but a campaign of economic warfare. By attacking Spanish ships and settlements, he seized immense wealth that directly enriched the English treasury. Elizabeth rewarded him not just with titles, but with permission to continue his raids under the guise of private enterprise. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. The crown gained funds without declaring open war, and Drake gained legitimacy and protection for his ventures. He became, in effect, a state-sponsored entrepreneur, a privateer whose exploits shaped national policy. The wealth Drake brought home financed England's defense and symbolized its challenge to Spanish dominance. His victory over the Spanish Armada later in his career, though achieved as part of an official naval command, had roots in his earlier private ventures. He had transformed piracy into patriotism, demonstrating how independent actors could influence state power. Yet his autonomy also revealed the limits of royal control. Privateers operated according to opportunity rather than obedience. Their loyalties were transactional, guided by profit and survival. While they served the crown when convenient, they also pursued their own agendas. This uneasy alliance between monarch and privateer reflected the broader relationship between money and power in the Tudor world. The crown depended on the wealth generated by commerce and conquest, but it could not fully dictate how that wealth was acquired. The seas, like the markets, were spaces where the state's reach met the individual's ambition. Drake and others like him, men such as John Hawkins and Martin Frobisher, embodied the merging of personal daring and national purpose. Their voyages expanded England's horizons and established patterns of trade and colonization that would later define empire. Yet they also exposed the moral ambiguities of power built on plunder and exploitation. The pirates and privateers were not isolated figures, but part of a larger system in which commerce, warfare, and policy overlapped. Their actions influenced diplomacy as much as finance. Spanish complaints about English piracy fueled tension that eventually erupted into open conflict. Meanwhile, the spoils of privateering fed England's economy, funding shipbuilding, fortifications, and further exploration. The Crown, often short of funds, relied on the unpredictable success of these ventures to maintain military readiness. In this sense, the pirates and privateers became unofficial financiers of the state, their fortunes tied to the nation's survival. The combination of Gresham's financial order, the Mercer's commercial networks, and the privateers' maritime daring created a new architecture of power, an economic foundation that would carry England beyond the Tudor age. Each represented a different aspect of the same transformation. The shift from feudal wealth to capitalist enterprise, from dependence on land to mastery of trade. Together they showed that the strength of the monarchy was inseparable from the prosperity and initiative of its subjects. The Tudors, for all their grandeur, ruled not only by divine right, but by the balance sheet. This web of financial and mercantile influence also reshaped the social hierarchy. Merchants and financiers gained access to titles and lands, blurring the line between nobility and commerce. Wealth, once viewed as the byproduct of rank, became its foundation. The Crown, in turn, used this new moneyed class to counterbalance the old aristocracy. Loans and privileges became tools of control, binding wealthy merchants to royal service. Yet the partnership was never entirely stable. The same forces that enriched the monarchy also empowered those who might challenge it. The independence of the guilds, the reach of international markets, and the unpredictable fortunes of privateers all demonstrated that wealth had its own momentum, often beyond the control of kings. The story of Tudor power thus ends where it began, with a recognition that authority is rarely solitary. The monarchs who shaped England's destiny did so not in isolation, but through collaboration with those who understood the language of influence, whether in politics, faith, or finance. The courtiers whispered policy, the women of the household shaped conscience, the scholars interpreted the stars, and the merchants calculated risk. The kingdom was sustained not only by obedience but by exchange, of goods, of favors, of knowledge. In the economic sphere, this exchange took its most concrete form. Gresham's mastery of markets demonstrated that stability required intellect and reputation more than force. The Mercer's command of trade laws and credit showed how organization could rival lineage. The privateers proved that wealth could be won through boldness as well as calculation. Together, they revealed the evolution of England from a realm of lords and vassals to a nation of investors and explorers. The economic architects of the Tudor world did more than sustain a dynasty. They laid the groundwork for a new understanding of power itself. They transformed money into an instrument of statecraft, turned commerce into a form of diplomacy, and made the pursuit of profit a matter of national pride. Their legacy would endure long after the Tudor crown had passed to another line. The structures they built, financial institutions, trading companies, and global networks, became the backbone of England's rise to empire. The story of money, merchants, and monarchs is not one of separate spheres but of convergence. The same ambition that drove courtiers to whisper for favor drove merchants to seek markets and sailors to chase fortune across the seas. Each acted within their world, yet all contributed to a single, expanding system of influence. The Tudors, with their splendor and contradictions, presided over this transformation without fully controlling it. They ruled an age in which power was no longer defined by the sword or the sermon alone, but by the coin, the contract, and the courage to take risks. Thus, the Tudor world, once seen only through crowns and battles, reveals itself as a network of creators and manipulators, of wealth, ideas, and ambition. It was a kingdom built as much in counting houses as in palaces, steered as much by merchants as by monarchs. The true story of its endurance lies not only in its pageantry, but in its pragmatism, in the hands of those who turned trade into influence and finance into the lifeblood of empire. Through their efforts, England emerged from the shadow of medieval uncertainty into the dawn of a global age, guided not only by kings and queens, but by the invisible architects of its prosperity. The legacy of Tudor England does not end with its monarchs, nor can it be fully understood through the crowns that adorn their heads. The story that endures beyond that dynasty belongs equally to those who shaped its unseen foundations. The administrators who structured policy, the women who guided hearts and alliances, the scholars who bridged knowledge and superstition, and the merchants who turned economic theory into survival. The shadows of these figures stretch far beyond the 16th century, influencing the social, political, and economic transformations that followed. What they built and what they altered continued to define England's direction long after their names faded from memory. The structures they helped to erect, the bureaucracies of governance, the disciplined financial systems, and the habits of strategic thinking, became the invisible spine of the modern state. Yet history has not been kind to those whose influence operated in quiet rooms or in the margins of royal proclamations. The very discretion that once made them powerful later rendered them invisible, as historians, poets, and dramatists preferred to focus on the glitter of the crown rather than the machinery beneath it. The enduring impact of these forgotten architects can be traced through the centuries that followed. When Sir Thomas Gresham established principles of fiscal responsibility and laid the groundwork for a modern exchange, he did not merely stabilize a troubled monarchy. He shaped the economic culture that would make England the financial capital of the world. His insistence on the integrity of credit and his recognition that confidence drives currency became central tenets of later economic thought. The financial discipline he introduced influenced the establishment of national banking systems and the fiscal practices of later governments. By encouraging trust between state and merchant, he created a foundation that later rulers and ministers would depend on. The success of the Bank of England, founded long after his death, owed much to the philosophy he demonstrated in practice, that the prosperity of a nation depends not simply on its treasure, but on the faith it inspires in those who lend to it. The legacy of the London mercers and other powerful guilds lived on in England's transformation from a feudal to a capitalist society. Their combination of commercial ambition, collective organization, and civic responsibility provided a model for later corporate and institutional governance. Their methods of record-keeping, apprenticeship, and accountability influenced the development of modern business practices. Moreover, their role in financing the crown and managing trade policy anticipated the rise of the industrial and mercantile elites who would later define Britain's empire. The mercers, through their network of trade and credit, helped transform London into a global hub long before the term existed. Their spirit of cooperation and competition laid the groundwork for the expansion of markets and the growth of private enterprise that characterized later centuries. The influence of the privateers and explorers continued to ripple outward as well. Figures like Francis Drake and John Hawkins not only filled the royal coffers, but also opened routes that future generations would follow. Their voyages, though driven by greed as much as loyalty, expanded England's reach and set patterns of maritime dominance. Their daring established a naval tradition that would become central to national identity. Even the contradictions of their careers, between piracy and patriotism, exploitation and discovery, echoed in the imperial ventures that followed. The empire that emerged in later centuries, with its complex mixture of commerce, conquest, and moral justification, was in many ways a direct descendant of the impulses and ambitions that drove Tudor privateers across the seas. Yet the legacy of the Tudor world is not only economic or political. The social and cultural shifts it fostered reverberated through generations. The influence of women like Anne Boleyn, whose presence reshaped the religious and political order of her time, left an indelible mark on how power was perceived. Her story, though often told as a tragic romance, represents something far larger: the capacity of personal relationships to alter the course of nations. The network she built, the alliances she encouraged, and the risks she took all challenged the accepted limits of gender and authority. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would embody that challenge, but Anne's influence extended beyond bloodline. It lay in the recognition that intellect and ambition could be instruments of change even in a world determined to silence them. The scholars, physicians, and astrologers who advised Tudor rulers also left traces in the evolving relationship between knowledge and power. Their role at court reflected a broader cultural transformation, the gradual shift from mystical explanation to rational inquiry. The monarchs who once sought counsel in the stars would, by the next century, sponsor exploration of the natural world through science. The very tension between superstition and emerging empirical thought that defined Tudor intellectual life paved the way for the scientific revolutions to come. The court astrologers and alchemists, though dismissed by later generations as charlatans, represented a vital step in humanity's search for understanding. They bridged the worlds of faith and reason, preparing the ground for the intellectual awakening that would later define modern Europe. Even the shadowy political operators like Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell left legacies that shaped governance for centuries. Wolsey's mastery of administrative control and his creation of centralized systems of record-keeping anticipated the modern bureaucratic state. Cromwell's reforms, particularly his reorganization of church property and his emphasis on legal and institutional order, transformed England's relationship with power itself. By breaking the hold of ecclesiastical authority and placing wealth and governance firmly under royal control, he set precedents that would endure even after his execution. The modern state, with its ministries, its reliance on paper and record, and its assertion of sovereignty over spiritual and local power, owes as much to his cold precision as to the charisma of any monarch. Mary's circle of confidants and household women also contributed to a legacy of influence that is only now being fully recognized. Their quiet mediation, their ability to manage access and emotion, and their shaping of the Queen's perspective represented early forms of what would later be known as soft power. They demonstrated that influence did not require formal authority to be effective. Their work anticipated the subtle forms of diplomacy, persuasion, and counsel that would define the politics of later courts and cabinets. If these figures had such lasting impact, why have so many of them been forgotten or reduced to footnotes in the grand narrative of history? The answer lies partly in the way history itself has been written. For generations, historians favored the spectacle of monarchy over the mechanisms that sustained it. The image of the solitary ruler, wise, tyrannical, or tragic, made for a simpler story. Complexity was inconvenient. The anonymous accountant, the quiet counselor, or the discreet woman behind the throne did not fit the heroic mold that chroniclers preferred. Theirs was a power difficult to depict because it operated through networks, influence, and nuance rather than through battles or decrees. Moreover, the preservation of historical memory often favored those who could afford it. Nobles and monarchs left behind letters, portraits, and monuments. Merchants and advisors, by contrast, left ledgers and contracts, documents that historians long treated as secondary to the grand narratives of state. The economic and social forces that truly shaped nations were hidden behind the curtain of royal drama. The contributions of women suffered even greater erasure. In a world that defined authority through male lineage and formal office, their influence was often reinterpreted as manipulation or accident. It was easier for chroniclers to portray Anne Boleyn as a seductress than as a political actor, or Mary's women as servants rather than strategists. Religion and politics also played their part in shaping memory. The Reformation and its aftermath divided the country not only in faith, but in interpretation. Figures like Wolsey, associated with the Catholic order, were recast as symbols of corruption rather than as architects of governance. Cromwell, tied to reform, was vilified or sanctified depending on the writer's allegiance. The shifting loyalties of later historians, reflecting their own times and ideologies, further distorted the record. The result was a history that celebrated moral clarity over ambiguity, kings over systems, and spectacle over substance. The forgetting of these figures also reflects a deeper discomfort with the idea that power can exist without formal recognition. Historians and readers alike have often preferred to believe that authority flows from visible sources, a crown, a title, a law. The notion that influence might reside in a merchant's account book, a woman's whispered advice, or a secretary's calculations challenges that assumption. It blurs the comforting boundaries between public and private, between the grand and the ordinary. To acknowledge the hidden architects of history is to admit that power is often diffuse, and that its truest forms are not always noble or visible. Yet as scholarship has evolved, there has been a growing recognition that history must include these unseen forces. The study of economic systems, gender roles, and social networks has revealed the depth of their impact. The once marginalized records, letters, inventories, guild minutes, and diaries now offer a more complete picture of the past. This shift has transformed not only how we view the Tudors, but how we understand history itself. It reminds us that no era can be fully grasped through its rulers alone. The policies of monarchs were shaped by the calculations of those who served them. Their victories were financed by merchants and sustained by laborers. Their beliefs were guided by advisors and shaped by private emotion. The re-evaluation of these hidden legacies has implications far beyond Tudor England. It invites us to question how history is written and whose voices it privileges. The forgotten figures of the 16th century are not unique. Every era has its invisible architects. In the industrial age, they were the engineers and financiers who built the machines of progress. In the modern world, they are the policymakers, scientists, and data analysts whose work shapes society while remaining largely unseen. By studying the Tudors' hidden influencers, we learn to recognize similar patterns in our own time. The interplay between visible authority and invisible structure, between leadership and the networks that sustain it. Re-examining these stories also challenges the way we assign credit and blame. Traditional narratives often seek clear heroes and villains, but the reality of power is rarely so simple. Wolsey's ambition was both his strength and his downfall, yet his administrative reforms outlived him. Cromwell's ruthlessness dismantled institutions that had resisted change, but it also created new forms of oppression. And Boleyn's influence opened the door to a new religious settlement, but it cost her life. Drake's courage expanded England's horizons while leaving moral scars that cannot be ignored. To understand them fully is not to celebrate or condemn, but to accept complexity, the essence of human history. The rediscovery of these figures thus serves as a call to action for anyone who seeks to understand the past honestly. It demands that we look beyond the obvious, that we question not only what is written, but who had the power to write it. Every omission in a chronicle, every silence in an archive, tells its own story. By filling these gaps, we recover not just facts but perspectives. We restore agency to those whose contributions shaped the world even when they were denied recognition. This is not merely an act of justice, but of comprehension. To see history whole, one must see it in all its layers. Such reevaluation also reminds us that power continues to operate in similar ways today. Behind every visible leader stands a network of advisors, financiers, and strategists who shape decisions. Public narratives often simplify these relationships, just as Tudor chroniclers once did, reducing complex systems to singular figures. By studying the hidden architects of the past, we learn to identify the hidden structures of our own time. We begin to understand that authority is always a collaboration between vision and execution, between command and counsel. The task of modern historians, educators, and thinkers is therefore not simply to retell old stories, but to re-examine the assumptions that shaped them. When we question who has been left out and why, we move closer to a truthful account of human experience. The unseen figures of Tudor England, merchants, advisors, women, scholars, remind us that history is not only made by those who wear crowns, but also by those who balance accounts, keep secrets, and take risks in silence. To look beyond the crown is to rediscover the essence of history itself. It is to see that the power of a nation lies not only in its rulers, but in the collective effort of its people, both visible and unseen. The endurance of England and later Britain was not the work of monarchs alone, but of systems built by those who understood that influence often thrives in shadow. Their legacies live on in the institutions that govern, the markets that sustain, and the values that define society. By recognizing their contribution, we not only honor the past, but equip ourselves to question the present, to ask, in every age, whose hands truly shape the world we inhabit. The story of Tudor England, seen through this wider lens, becomes not just a tale of kings and queens, but a mirror of human complexity. It reveals that power, in all its forms, depends on collaboration, and that history is richer when we listen to the whispers as well as the proclamations. The forgotten figures of that era challenge us to keep looking beyond the crown, to seek the unseen, to question the written, and to understand that the true architects of history are often those whose names history tried to erase.